Welcome to the third lecture in this series. This one is a lot more practical. So lecture 2, you will have found challenging. There's a ton of technical material in there. People will have had varying backgrounds, varying levels of familiarity with it. What I want to do now is show you what you can do with all this stuff. Okay, so we talk about kind of making the data talk. How can we listen to what the data want to tell us? And so to give you an example of that, I'm going to draw on my own work, looking at the trade and value chain relationships between Asia and Latin America and the Caribbean. So this is using the ADB and partners multi-region input-output table, and specifically the WWZ indicators that ADB has calculated from that. So key takeaways, what do I want you to walk out with from this class? So, the first one is sort of stylistic. Once we've got these indicators, it's actually pretty simple to tell a really nice and detailed story of what is going on at the level of value chain trade, whether we're talking about countries, sectors, bilateral linkages, whatever. And really, all we need to look at is foreign value added, pure double counting, and then forward linkages, which is this concept of domestic value added that is re-exported. Okay, so using just those 3 indicators, we can tell a fantastic story about what global value chains look like in a given region. Second point, the manipulations that we have to perform once we've got the WWZ decomposition, that's the hard part. So the easy part in data terms is manipulating the WWZ decomposition into these terms that we're interested in for policy purposes. ADB has done the hard work for us. They've produced the indicators. So our job is then to manipulate them to produce these aggregates that are informative for policy purposes. You can do that in your favorite math or statistics package. You can even do it in Excel, okay? So the barrier to entry, once we've got the indicators, is actually pretty low. Of course, that doesn't mean that the work is easy. It just means that we've got the raw ingredients. What we really need to do is part 3, and that is tell a story, okay? That's where the real trick is. A couple of sort of hints for telling the story. We're always going to look at differences across countries. Okay, typically we're interested in regions or income groups or some grouping of countries. So we're going to look at what sort of variation we see across countries. If we're looking at a single country for whatever reason, we're going to be interested in sectoral variation. What do we learn from the degree of value chain integration in one sector versus what it is in another sector? What does the difference between goods and services look like? These sorts of questions. And then of course, another one that's not on the slide is the development of these variables over time. Okay, what can we learn from a policy perspective about the time trends that we see in these variables? So final point, the user guide has got all sorts of code that's included with it. You can easily adapt that code, freely available, take it, use it as you please. If Stata is not your preferred software, you can easily use other software, whatever it may be. You can easily adapt this, is the short story, to your own policy settings, your own policy questions. And what I'm hoping is that after these lectures, you can really quickly just pick up and use these indicators to say something interesting from a policy perspective. So what am I going to do in this lecture? Basically 5 parts. Quickly introduce the topic and tell you what I'm going to do. I'm going to look at the temporal dimension, then I'm going to look at the sectoral dimension, and then I'm going to look at some country details. So remember those 3 levels of disaggregation that I just mentioned. I'm going to quickly show you what you can do with that. Then of course I'll wrap up with some concluding thoughts. So there is a whole paper that goes with this presentation, which hopefully will be available to you. There are Stata files that go with the paper, and they take the WWZ decomposition from ADB and manipulate it in some simple ways to make the data talk. So what problem am I trying to solve by doing this work? Well, basically, I want to answer the following question. What does GVC integration look like between Asia and Latin America and the Caribbean? Okay. Now, in the paper, I look at East Asia, Southeast Asia, and Australia on the one hand, and then LAC on the other. It gets a bit repetitive to present all of that. So I'm just going to take one slice of the data, which is focusing on East Asia and its partners. So I'll show you the way that I think we can usefully slice and dice the data here. Now, of course, there are many, many ways that analysts can answer this question. It's a very broad question. My way is one way. I'm not necessarily claiming it's the only way or even the best way. But it is one way of doing it. You, of course, will come up with your individual ways of doing this sort of thing. But basically, what I want to do is, firstly, track value chain participation over time. And I'm going to do that by looking at FVA and PDC. So remember, we can take the sum of FVA and PDC, and a higher score on that sum is indicative of greater GVC participation. Then I can flip perspectives and I can say, okay, let's look at DVA interx, which is this forward linkages concept. And we can say, okay, a high score on that indicates greater GVC participation from the other perspective. Then I can break it down by sub-regional pairs, okay, because we're starting from a bilaterally and sectorally consistent decomposition. And then I can break it down by sector for the most recent year. So again, this is just giving you a sense of the sorts of results that I've been able to pull out. Now, I do think the aggregation issue is worth noting. When you first start doing this work, sometimes it's tempting to do it at a very aggregate level. Sometimes for a very introductory policy purpose, that can be useful if we want to know, generally speaking, what's going on in a region. But there is so much variation across countries and across sectors that I think nearly always we end up drilling down to those levels of detail. Okay, so in interpretation again, just before we get into it, that's really the whole secret to this. FVA, you remember, is backward linkages, so foreign sourced intermediate goods and services that are incorporated in the home country's exports. Forward linkages concept, exports from the home country that are intermediates used in the production of some other country's exports. And then we have pure double counting, that is to say, movements of goods and services backwards and forwards across borders numerous times during the production process. Now, the levels of these things, that is to say their value in a particular time period, is interesting, and you should always pay attention to that. More interesting for policy purposes, I think, is a breakdown in terms of percentages. And the reason that that's interesting is that an increase in the dollar value of FVA doesn't really tell us whether there is relatively more or less GVC participation. It's only if we look at how the proportion changes, that is to say foreign value added divided by gross exports or value added, whichever you prefer. It's only if we see that ratio changing that we can really draw a clear conclusion. Okay, so let's have a look at it over time. You can see that I've got a graph, a figure on the left-hand side there, 3 time periods, 2007, 2011, 2017. That's the availability of the data. And what I've done here is simply put together some stacked bar charts. So each bar sums to 100%. The blue part of the bar is domestic value added. The maroon part of the bar is foreign value added. And the green part is pure double counting. So you can see the different proportions of these things in exports over time. Then the other thing that I've done, at least for this, this initial pass, is to aggregate countries into groups. So I've said, let's look at East Asia, Australia, Southeast Asia, and LAC. Okay, and then I've constructed all of the pairs across those groups. So each pairing corresponds to a single bar. Now, if we try to pull a couple of results out of this, we find the highest proportion of GVC trade is exports from Southeast Asia to East Asia. Around 40% of those exports are GVC trade. That's not a surprising result. We know that production networks are a fundamental part of the economy in East and Southeast Asia, and we know that those two sub-regions are very closely integrated. So at first pass, the data tells us something that we probably at least expected. Now, we see considerably lower levels for LAC and Australia. Okay, so we're seeing some GVC trade in all regions, but notably stronger in Southeast Asia and also in East Asia, where we're seeing about 20% than in LAC and Australia. If we look at it from the opposite perspective, that is to say forward linkages, we see that Southeast Asia gets to about 30% of gross exports being forward linkages. The chart here, as you can see from the title, is DVA indirects divided by gross exports, converted to a percentage. And then we can see that East Asia's exports has a strong component of inputs from Australia, but then exports back to Australia are largely final use or not for export. So again, that tells us something that I think we probably know, which is to say that we're seeing a substantial amount of intermediate goods, likely primary commodities, exported from Australia to East Asia. And then we're seeing finished consumer goods coming back from East Asia to Australia. Again, something that we likely suspect. What we have here is a very nice quantification of it and something that we can track across time. Now, let's have a quick look at the sectoral dynamics. So manufacturing has the strongest backward linkages in terms of its GVC development. So here you can see, again, same figure as before, but I've grouped the sectors into agriculture, mining, manufacturing, and services. We have the bilateral pairs, so it's East Asia as paired with Southeast Asia, Australia, and LAC. Again, we find the strongest linkage coming out in Southeast Asia in manufacturing, around 40%. I don't find there's anything particularly surprising in that. So as I said, these two sub-regions we know are closely integrated. We know that GVC trade is important, and we know that it's centered on manufacturers. So as a bit of a truth check, the data are telling us very much what we expect from secondary sources. Now, here's where we can start to say something a bit more interesting. Let's take a look at DVA indirects. And again, we're expressing it as a percentage. Same sectoral breakdown, so agriculture, mining, manufacturing, and services. Same meaning of the bars. It's East Asia with each of its bilateral partners, so Southeast Asia, Australia, and LAC. And so what we find when we look through this is that East Asia is really playing a role as an assembly hub. That is to say, we can see from the previous figure that it's got strong backward linkages. Okay, so it's importing a lot of intermediate inputs from elsewhere. But increasingly, it's becoming an input supplier. So we're also seeing evidence of forward linkages, and that evidence is growing over time. Now, again, if we think of what makes up East Asia, and this is a point that we'll come to in a moment, if we think of China's economic progress over the time period that we're looking at, that's very much the sort of progress that we're seeing. So starting as an assembly hub, and then gradually moving into higher value added activities, which include the production of intermediate inputs. So it would make sense, given that dynamic that we find anecdotally, it makes sense that we would see that again in the data as maintaining this strong performance in backward linkages, but then increasingly adding the forward linkages. Now, there's one result that stands out at me here as sort of a bit strange, which is the result on services from East Asia to Southeast Asia. It's other business services, and I'm not quite sure what that is. I mean, I know what the sector involves. I'm just not sure concretely what that means in terms of seeing such strong forward linkages in that sector. So again, this is something, if I were advising a country based on this sort of analysis, I'd want to bury into that much further to try and figure out what's going on there. Okay, now we can look a little bit at the variation across countries. So here we've got GVC trade, so foreign value added plus pure double counting, expressed as a percentage of gross exports. Now you can see here why I said at the outset that it's really important to disaggregate, okay, because we've looked at these results on an aggregate level, and you can see that splitting up the exporters into individual countries, even when we keep the aggregate importer regions, that is to say Australia, LAC, East Asia and Southeast Asia, we find tremendously different results as we go across those. Even for the same exporting countries across importing regions, we see substantial differences. So backward linkages we can see here vary quite considerably across countries, within countries, across partners. And when we look down the data, we see that Korea, Taiwan, China, and Hong Kong, China stand out as having particularly high levels of GVC trade in most pairings. Now, from a policy perspective, this is something that I go into some detail about in the paper. We would obviously talk about the particular role of countries in LAC. Okay, so I'm just using East Asia as an example for this lecture. We can equally well do it with LAC. And there we find some interesting things because there are different patterns of specialization. A country like Chile, heavily specialized in mining. Other countries in LAC more heavily specialized in different sorts of primary production. But often what we find is that the GVC integration is a bit lighter than we might expect in manufacturing and a bit stronger in some of the primary sectors. And I think that corresponds with what we know anecdotally, which is that Latin America and the Caribbean participates a little less in value chains than regions like East and Southeast Asia. And when it participates, it tends to be in as an input supplier, but focusing on these more primary sectors rather than manufacturing. Now, there's all sorts of reasons for that related to comparative advantage and many other factors. But as a policy question, that's really important because when we're thinking about what GVC development might look like in Latin America, that's obviously a crucial consideration. When we look at forward linkages, and again, here we're just breaking out East Asia and looking at the picture across importing regions, we again find a picture that's a bit reminiscent of the one that we just looked at. And what it suggests is that countries tend to engage in these two types of linkage, that is to say backward linkages and forward linkages simultaneously. Okay, so that is to say countries that are shipping off a whole bunch of inputs that are used in the production of other countries' exports at the same time tend themselves to import a whole bunch of their own intermediate inputs, goods and services. And so I just ask a question here. I'm not going to answer it in the lecture, but you can have a think about it from a policy perspective. You know, you hear policymakers say sometimes that we want to bring our supply chain, you know, back on shore, but we want to keep exporting. Now, what this analysis suggests is that it might not be as simple as that. So how close is the logical fit between that sort of a policy where ideally we would source a lot more of our inputs locally with the objective of still being an input supplier to the world? Okay, the data tend to suggest that it's imports in both directions, imports in one direction, exports in the other, tend to go together. So what risks do we run in trying to break that apart? Because I think that's a key policy question that we're all going to be thinking about as we go forward. So look, I've just given you a quick run through some of what's in the paper. The paper has obviously a much lengthier discussion. This is just a few key results for one of the exporting regions to give you an idea of how we would start pulling this data out and talking about it from a policy perspective. So if I can wrap up on that point, first, I do encourage you to read the paper if you can. The sort of quantitative work that we're doing is relatively new. Okay, so the indicators haven't been around particularly long. And because they are so technical, I think many policy analysts still experience a bit of difficulty in interpreting them and using them. So I think a lot of what we do in this sort of research is to ask good questions and start looking at what the elements of a response might be. We're not really being too definitive at this point. But hopefully in what I've shown you, I've demonstrated that there are some interesting dynamics that we can pull out, even when we look in the data, at the data in a relatively straightforward way. So I hope that this sort of template, obviously it's not one size fits all, but I do hope that it's something that you can pick up and have a go at in the empirical exercise. And I'll be really keen to see what you come up with.